Welcome to the George Washington University. My name is Mark Lynch. I'm the director of the Project on Middle East Political Science, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to this outstanding conference on inclusivity and pluralism in the Arab world. This is a project which was conducted by Rice University's Baker Institute, and I will be very briefly handing the microphone over to A.Kadir Yildirim, my friend who has been directing this project, and will have much more to say about it. I just wanted to say a couple of things very quickly. Several of you have asked about the Wi-Fi, the important stuff, and there's an open network, GW Connect, which you should be able to access immediately, and there's also EDU Roam for those of you who have access through an educational institution. If you have any other issues, feel free to ask one of us. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kadir to GW.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I want to thank POMEPS and George Washington University for hosting us, Mark Lynch and Stephanie here, and also Carnegie Corporation of New York for funding this project. So this is a project that we've been working on for about 2 years. We're wrapping up at the end of this month. So our goal was to tackle one of the most important issues in the Middle East, which is pluralism and inclusion. And the resolution of this issue has important, significant implications for policy and policy outcomes in the region. And democratization more broadly. Looking back at the beginning of the Arab Spring process, we see that major sections of the society had an interest in seeing themselves integrated in the political, economic, social system because of the nature of authoritarian governments. These groups have been excluded one way or another from decision-making mechanisms. So in that regard, our goal was to shed light on some of the important issues on pluralism and inclusion or exclusion. Our focus in the project has been on 3 different dimensions: political inclusion, political pluralism, economic pluralism, and socio-religious pluralism. To this end, we commissioned papers to 10 of the leading scholars, policy experts working on the region. And many of them are here today with us. And they have, first, we have policy briefs that are coming out of this research. So you can find them at the table over there or at the entrance, and feel free to grab some of those. And these are the condensed versions of working papers, much longer in length and more in detail in terms of treatment of some of these topics. In addition, as part of this project, we held workshops in different countries in the region, in Morocco on PJD and its inclusion in the political system, well, governance rather, in recent years, and Nahda's inclusion into the political system after 2011 in Tunisia. We had a workshop in Kuwait talking about pluralism broadly. We have some excellent work on how the change in electoral system in Kuwait has affected political pluralism there. We have stuff on gender, on Islamists and Salafis in Kuwait. We also had another workshop in Jordan. My colleague Christian held a workshop in London because of logistical issues. We couldn't hold it in the Gulf, and that was on political economy of the Gulf region. Lastly, we conducted a public opinion survey in collaboration with YouGov in 10 countries, 9,000 respondents. I'm going to share the results of that survey later this morning, but we have some interesting findings there. Okay. So we have most of the stuff available online at our website at bakerinstitute.org. Many of them are also available in print here. So if you don't have the program, you can, Colton can give you one. We have the bios and topics included in there, more information about the project itself. We have one change to the program. Mohammed Evren Tok, unfortunately, is unable to join us, coming from Qatar. He has some health issues, and his doctor advised against his travel, unfortunately. So my colleague Christian is going to take his place in the program. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Ziadeh, Susan Ziadeh. Ambassador Ziadeh is retired from the State Department, has enjoyed a 23-year career with the U.S. Department of State, where she most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Between May and October 2016, she served as the NEA Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. She's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, class of Minister Counselor, and served as the U.S. Ambassador to the State of Qatar between 2011 and 2014. Previously, she served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, as the official spokesperson at U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and as the Deputy Chief of Mission at U.S. Embassy in Bahrain. Her other overseas postings include Riyadh, Kuwait, Amman, and Jerusalem. In Washington, she was responsible for the Jordan desk and served as Acting Deputy Director of the Office for Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Ambassador Ziadeh received her PhD in history from the University of Michigan, which I respect, but I don't like as an Ohio State graduate, I have to say. We should watch the game this year. And an MA from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and a BA from the University of Washington. She's a 2004 distinguished graduate of the National War College, National Defense University, with an MS in National Security Strategy. She received the Department of State Superior Honor Award numerous times. She was awarded the Department of State's 2007 Edward Murrow Award for Excellence in Public Diplomacy. She was also awarded the Department of State's 2014 Arnold Rayful Memorial Award for Leadership. In 2015, the Secretary of Defense awarded her the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. The Emir of the State of Qatar conferred on Ambassador Ziadeh the Emiri Sash of Merit in 2014 in recognition of her success as ambassador in strengthening bilateral relations. Ambassador Ziadeh currently is also a member of the Middle East Institute's Board of Governors. Please welcome Ambassador Ziadeh for her remarks.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and the Carnegie Corporation for the kind invitation to participate in this important conference. And I would also like to thank the co-host of the conference, the Project on Middle East Political Science here at George Washington University. I'm going to do sort of a combination of reading some remarks and doing a little extemporaneous speaking. I will try and stick to the time, but if I'm going too long, give me a signal and we can just cut straight to the Q&A. Today, I'm going to do a slightly different approach to this subject because I'd like to address the issue of the Arab Spring as a former U.S. diplomat. And I will do so from my perch after many years dealing with the Arab Gulf countries. I spent the last 14 years dealing with the Gulf region, the GCC region mostly, including 12 years in the region and 2 years in Washington responsible for the region. But that said, I want to stress that my comments and my observations are being offered in my own personal capacity. They are not a reflection of formal U.S. policy. I've retired from the State Department, and I'm not authorized to speak on their behalf, nor do I represent their views. I will try and touch on some U.S. responses to the protests as they took place in the Arab world. And I will look to a few examples to demonstrate that. And I think, likewise, it's useful to look at how the Gulf countries responded to the Arab Spring, both internally and externally. So let's look at sort of our initial U.S. Policy reaction to the Arab Spring. Now, I should say that when it took place, I was in Saudi Arabia. So I was not in Washington in where policy circles were, but I certainly had a bird's eye view to what was going on in the region, which I think actually was much more interesting. But what I want to say is that I think if one were to look at some of the initial reactions from Washington, people weren't prepared. Obviously, it caught everybody unawares, whether it was in Washington, European capitals, or in the Arab world. And the thing that was very clear that came out of certain areas within the United States government is that we, as in the U.S. government, wanted to be on the right side of history. There was such a sense of this being such a moment in history and not wanting to be on the wrong side, to be on the right side of history. And many others agreed with that. But they were sobered by our experience in Iraq and its unintended consequences. And there was a sense that we needed a clear initial policy strategy because we didn't want the pendulum to swing so precipitously without a plan of how to move forward. The idea was that with all these quick changes, the policy needed to focus on how these countries would respond to the protesters, in some cases anticipating there might be transitions to new leadership, but not knowing for sure, but that if that transpired, how we would handle it, and in some cases, if it didn't, how would we still ensure continuity and stability while still giving protesters and their supporters a future horizon where their grievances would be addressed. So that was really the conundrum for people in Washington. That was felt by us out in the field and looking for certainly the input from the different countries in terms of what their reactions were and how they were, what their concerns were. So in Saudi Arabia, as in other parts of the Gulf, there was fear, there was anger, there was disbelief. The leaders in the Gulf saw their Tunisian and Egyptian counterparts as weak, conceding too much and emboldening the opposition, because for them, Egypt was too big to fail, meaning they could not afford to have it fail. And so a lot of the fury was directed at us, the U.S., for what they perceived was our desertion of a friend of 30 years. And I can tell you, they voiced it very loudly with senior visitors in those first few days, particularly in the period of Egypt when Mubarak was still in power, but the protesters were making it very difficult for him to hold on in that 3-week period. We had a number of senior-level visitors, including cabinet. And the ambassador happened to be out of country. I was chargé, so I did all the meetings with the senior leadership in Saudi Arabia. And they were not happy, and they made their displeasure known to us quite strongly. The common theme in the Gulf really was, all right, what's happening next? And most importantly, what does it mean for them? So, for us, as the United States, in addition to sort of our national security interests in the Gulf, which include obviously regional security and free flow of energy, counterterrorism cooperation, and a hedge against Iran, we also assessed what was the importance of stability in the GCC states in terms of what it meant for other regional countries. In other words, what was the impact of aid, investment, trade, labor remittances, and oil, whereby what took place in these Gulf countries and their security actually correlated and had an impact on the security of other key countries in the region, for example, Jordan and Egypt. So in Saudi Arabia, let's put it 2011, there was real concern about the reaction of the populace in Saudi Arabia, particularly because memories were still raw after the destruction and loss of life in the November 2009 floods in Jeddah. This hung over people's thinking quite a bit. And there were a number of people in Saudi Arabia on all sides of the political spectrum who started to mobilize. And in particular, what the Saudi establishment, from what we were able to judge, feared was that with the uprisings in Tunis and Egypt, that might inspire Saudi Islamists to then take to calling for reforms, which indeed they did by circulating petitions in the kingdom. I would say peaceful petitions, but petitions nonetheless in the voice of the people in February of 2011, declaring towards a state of rights and institutions. Although when organizers for a March 2011 Day of Rage started putting out announcements about a big rally and marches and protests across the kingdom, the Islamists did not formally support it. Although privately it's unclear, but formally they did not. And with the steps taken by the security forces, that Day of Rage never materialized. Now, I remember it very clearly as the deputy chief of mission, my responsibility was security for the embassy. And in times of like that, one always has to think that if they can't make inroads with the host nation in terms of protests, they often do turn to the United States Embassy, as unfortunately we saw subsequently in Libya several years later. So the large law enforcement presence was again, was there in key installations in the kingdom. Show of force was certainly the order of the day. And then the GCC states basically did what they do best, which is resisting the wave of change through financial incentives. So across the region, you start seeing immediate salary increases, bonuses, particularly for the military, internal security, other government employees, which if you look at the structure in the Gulf is the majority of people who work there, and not surprisingly, and actually very smartly on the part of at least Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure other countries, to religious leaders and their institutions. So a lot of that got buttoned down in a way that was very important to make people feel that they had a stake in keeping things quiet. Nonetheless, the Gulf states were watching the developments with keen interest. And perhaps I would like to touch a little bit on Egypt, because in many ways that was the biggest force that preoccupied them in the early days, and how the Gulf states approached Egypt a bit differently. I know Amy Hawthorne will probably be speaking on that more at length later. So when former President Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood rose to power in Egypt, after first a popular revolution and second a democratic election, many GCC monarchies, of course, aside from Qatar, were alarmed, deeply alarmed. And they were worried that the Muslim Brotherhood would export their successful revolutions to the monarchies of the Gulf countries. And they knew that, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood has a long history in the Gulf countries, from the 50s and 60s when they first came as educators and bureaucrats and functionaries, and then, of course, had a presence as a informal political grouping in many of these countries, at times on okay terms with the governments, depending upon what other trends are in the region, for example, in the 50s and 60s as a bulwark against Arab nationalism, and at times not so welcome when there was fear that they were going to take up positions that were antithetical to the government position, particularly in Saudi Arabia in the 90s, after the Gulf War. So, and then there's Saudi Arabia that looks at the Muslim Brotherhood ideology as, competing for allegiance among the Gulf populations, potentially challenging their religious legitimacy and their religious legitimacy, which is tied to the Wahhabi state. And the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as a strategic threat because Egypt's regime change meant a closer alliance between Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, which for them was unacceptable because it meant the success of political Islam as the wave of the future. So in 2013, when I'm going to put in quotes the takeover by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, because in the United States government, that's what we called it. We never termed it what it really was. Ousted the Islamist regime and basically restoring a secular and authoritarian rule, it obviously led to a shakeup of alliances. So that first day, statements from Saudi Arabia and the UAE right off the bat. But what was interesting for me, sitting at that time, in 2013, I was ambassador to Qatar, so I was sitting in Doha, was watching the Turkish foreign minister, Davutoglu, leave Istanbul and start his trajectory across visiting European capitals. And then the next day, watching the Qatari foreign minister in his footsteps, visiting those same European capitals, as if the 1-2 punch to drum up support for a rollback of what took place in Egypt. So the lines were very clearly drawn in the Gulf in terms of where they came out on Egypt. Now, we knew that Qatari loans to Egypt that had begun under Morsi were being repaid, and repaid quickly once Sisi came into power. But of course, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait replaced it with this huge cash infusion very, very quickly to make sure that there was no question where the Egyptians should come out. I will note, just as a not often known fact, that Qatari LNG shipments, natural gas shipments, that were a preset number determined even from the time right after the revolution under General Tantawi, which had begun then, continued unto Morsi. And actually, the last 2 shipments were delivered in the first few months of el-Sisi's rule. So the Qataris did honor their pledge on that, and they didn't pull back the LNG because, as they said, it was for the Egyptian people. So the Gulf is split where it comes to Egypt. So now let's look at Syria as another example. Syria, when I was in Saudi Arabia between 2009 and 2011, Syria was a big issue for the Saudis. And King Abdullah in particular was very keen on trying to figure out a way to pull Bashar away from Iran and see how he could bring him back into a more Arab, I'm going to be careful not saying Sunni fold, but Arab fold. Let's put it that way. And there had been a thought that maybe he had been not courted enough, not given enough incentive. And he had basically appointed his son, Abdulaziz, who basically was on a plane coming and going between Riyadh and Damascus, and had developed quite a strong relationship with Bashar in ways to see how he could bring him back closer to the Saudis. And in the early days, and it was hoped that that would work. And then with the early days of protests, you started seeing ministers from different GCC countries visiting, trying to convince Bashar how to deal with the protesters in a way that makes for some conciliation, some addressing of issues, but how to move forward in a way that protects the people and yet preserves his interests, hoping that he would see his interests more with Saudi Arabia than with Iran. Now, for our part as the U.S., early on we called for al-Assad to go. But we didn't engage with significant military aid, which would have strengthened the Free Syrian Army and more moderate fighting forces on the ground. Now, that was an issue of great discussion within the United States decision-making policy apparatus. Certainly also with our friends, the Europeans. And quite frankly, we were being encouraged by our GCC allies to move in that direction. And early on, we created a Friends of Syria mechanism where the different parties to the conflict, plus the GCC and the Europeans, the US, UK, France, would be able to meet regularly to look at diplomatic strategies, humanitarian assistance, etc. So from 2011 to 2013, we supplied non-lethal aid to the opposition. But it really wasn't enough. In 2013, we approved lethal small arms, not the kinds of arms that they wanted, to the opposition Syrian Military Council. And that was only after the administration concluded that the Assad government had used chemical weapons on opposition forces. So in other words, when the Syrian regime crossed Obama's red line, our response was to say, we brokered a deal with Russia to destroy Syrians' chemical stockpile, rather than showing a strong show of force, which undermined our credibility with our partners. And it became clearer to them that maybe not diplomatically, but militarily, that they were going to more or less go it alone. Now, U.S. focus since 2014 certainly was the anti-ISIS campaign in Syria, and doing it in consort with our GCC coalition partners, which I think they felt maybe would be a way of bringing us back into the Syria opposition support, which is what they were looking for. But in essence, what it did by our focus on the anti-ISIS campaign is basically it separated our ISIS mission from the larger Syrian conflict, ceding the field to Russian, Iranian, and Syrian government forces. But nonetheless, the U.S. did supply humanitarian assistance, stabilization assistance into liberated areas. We worked with local councils and NGOs to establish infrastructures and begin reconstruction. So how did the GCC countries react to this Syrian civil war? The brutal destruction of the country, the loss of life, which weighed heavily on their leadership. Their approaches differed. Hold on just a minute. Yeah. Oman has generally had good relations with Iran. And so they sought to play a mediating role early on. And you could see Yusuf bin Alawi traveling to Damascus and playing the elder statesman role. The UAE has been fairly cautious in its approach to Syria, although they oppose the Assad regime. And they were greatly concerned about the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIS. Kuwait has, by habit, largely avoided participation in external conflicts, in this case in part because it didn't want to unnecessarily antagonize its relatively well-assimilated Shia population. I would note here, though, Kuwaiti private citizen fundraising for Syrian insurgents was well known and was very active. So even if on a governmental level there was caution, on the level of the people, there was a very well-oiled network of finance, some of which went into hands of individuals that certainly would end up on the U.S. terror finance list. Qatar worked even more closely with Turkey in Syria than it did with Saudi Arabia. And yet, Qatar shared Saudi Arabia's concerns about Iranian influence in Syria. And even though Qatar has slightly better relations with Iran today, I would say that probably still holds. Even if they don't say it, I think it does still hold. Qatar and Saudi Arabia really were determined to use the Syrian conflict to curtail Tehran's inroads into the Arab world. Saudi Arabia, although concerned that local Muslim Brotherhood played a prominent role in the opposition, nonetheless, they supported the opposition. And so while both Qatar and Saudi Arabia shared the goal of toppling the Assad regime, their support for different leaders and factions in the opposition Syrian National Council weakened the council diplomatically. And we saw that a lot of the Syrian opposition actually was headquartered between Qatar and Istanbul, some in other capitals like Paris, but we had quite a number in Qatar. And I used to joke that I may be the ambassador to Qatar, but yet there is so much more that is going on that I have to know about Syria. So we looked to how these countries were channeling military assistance along with Turkey to the different fighting groups. And even though they might be of slightly different political persuasion, but actually the differences were not as stark as how some media and some scholars seem to think they were, based upon my experience in talking to the Syrians and talking to the Qataris and Saudis and some of the groups about this. So I have 3 minutes, and I am wondering, can I do just a little bit on Yemen? And then, okay, it may take a little bit more than 3 minutes. Okay. Yemen, because that also was an area of great importance to the GCC and to us and is ongoing till even today. So we're going to quick forward just in very short terms. You know, the GCC states had already been involved in the issue of Yemen with the GCC initiative, working with the EU, the UN, the US, UK. When the protests took place in Yemen in 2011, basically, not only with youth, but with political elites who were trying to replace Ali Abdullah Saleh. When the fighting broke out and government authority eroded, and of course, the fear for us is when we saw Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula again regain strength in ungoverned territory. The US, Saudi Arabia, and other members of the international community attempted to broker a compromise, which is why we came forward with the transition plan under the new president, Hadi, and with the support of all of these players, an attempt through the National Dialogue Conference to reach a consensus on a new political order. There was no consensus, and by January 2014, the whole process basically fell apart. Fast forward, by September 2014, and I remember it well, it was my first day on the job as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, the Houthis took Sana'a. And I said, oh God, this is how my assignment is going to start. And it only went downhill from there. We watched the Houthis come from the north, take Sana'a, move towards the south as they approached Aden they pretty well blitzkrieged the whole way, of course, in consolidation with elements of the Republican Guard that had switched sides from the government and gone to fight with the Houthis. We can maybe get to the question in the question and answer period, something about the coalition, but the coalition that was formed, the Saudis, the Emiratis, along with the government, the internationally recognized government, which was routed from Sana'a and now sits part in Aden and part in Saudi Arabia, was formed in 2015 with an eye to return to a political process linked to the GCC initiative and the National Dialogue Outcomes and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2216. Now, we as the United States have determined, obviously, to provide humanitarian assistance and work with our partners in ways to open up shipping and other kinds of ways for humanitarian assistance. But basically, in a nutshell, our interests were the restoration of the legitimate Yemeni government, which is why we supported the coalition. We wanted to protect the Saudi border from ground assaults and rocket attacks. And we wanted to defeat al-Qaeda, which had now spread. Now, of course, inherent in that, although not formally articulated as our reason for support, is pushing back on malign Iranian influence and support for the Houthis. So, but we know that ultimately there has to be a political process. The U.S. is concerned about the destruction and the loss of life. In the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 was language put in there that talks about the issue of the U.S. military and the State Department having to certify that the coalition is doing what they can in terms of the prosecution of the war to avoid the loss of innocent civilian life. Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis were on the Hill yesterday certifying to that effect. But it has raised a lot of questions, not just now, actually, I think since the coalition went in terms of our support and questions of laws of armed conflict and the disposition of innocents who are caught in the crosshairs of war. So we do have a role to play, and we are working as a country with our partners to try and see how we can bring the parties to the table. There have been talks. The talks that were supposed to take place in Geneva did not take place. There have been formal talks. There have been quiet talks. There have been unpublicized talks, some of which, one or two that I've attended or participated in. But we really are not any closer today than we were when this started. So the big question is, what happens now with the battle for Hudaydah? And will that be enough to turn the tide to really give each side enough of what they feel they need to come to the table? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. Would you like to do, or would you like me to call?
You call.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. The scholar Toby Mathiasen, who's written about the Saudi Shia, makes the point that during the Day of Rage, the Saudi authorities played the sectarian card to their advantage. In other words, they were saying that the Shia are going to have an uprising, so for the Sunni not to participate. Was that your impression from your vantage point in Riyadh when you were there, or how did the sectarian issue play into that development?
That's interesting. I mean, Toby's a good scholar, so I'm sure he looks at things. I don't recall it being as big as that. There were always concerns about the Shia. You know, that's their eastern flank, which is why, of course, there are always concerns about Bahrain and why Peninsula Shield went into Bahrain when things were getting out of hand there. You know, at the time, Mohammed bin Nayef was in charge of security, mabahith and security. And he was actually very intelligent about how he worked security issues, particularly in the Shia areas. And I'm sure there was real concern, and probably there were tougher positions taken. It may have been an argument that was used quietly, but I didn't see or recall anything that was publicly said along those lines, because I think what they didn't want was to inflame tensions with the Shia as well, watching what was happening next door in Bahrain, because that was very concerning to them.
Yes, ma'am.
You brought up at the beginning the resentment of the Gulf countries against the United States for not having backed Mubarak when the demonstration started. A lot of Egyptians had the same position. Do you think it would have made any difference in the way the situation unfolded if the United States had issued a strong declaration of support for Mubarak in the early days?
You know, I'm seeing Nathan sitting next to you, who knows Egypt far better than I, and I imagine that Amy will...
Your answer, I talk to Nathan all the time.
Well, I think, you know, Amy might address that this afternoon when she talks about Egypt. So I think I would ask you to hold your question and maybe address it to her. Okay.
Imad Salami from Lebanese American University.
Hi, Imad.
I'm wondering how much did Obama's policy toward Iran with a nuclear deal, while the Arab Spring is going on, played into kind of working up a strategy of balance between Shia and Sunni. How much do you make truth into that the Obama administration was at one point trying to strengthen Iran's position rather than to weaken Iran's position as to create a balance of power between Sunni and Shia?
Certainly strengthening Iran's position was never a U.S. foreign policy objective. And quite the opposite. I think I spent more time on a plane going to the Gulf working from 2014 to 2016. I mean, in that period, once it was announced about the Iran deal, working with GCC counterparts on things like security, regional security, military training, information sharing, countering terror finance, a whole slew of working groups that came out of the GCC U.S. summits that Obama held in ways to reassure them that indeed they are our allies and we're looking to strengthen them individually and strengthen them as a group for purposes of interoperability. Now, 2011, I don't even know, to be honest with you, when exactly the talk started. I've never seen it published, so maybe somebody else knows. But those talks were quiet for quite a bit of time. But I don't feel that influenced our reaction to the Arab Spring. For example, in Bahrain, where we took a position of trying to protect the protesters and the people and see how we could help the government and particularly the Crown Prince work with some of the opposition to find ways where steps could be taken, confidence-building measures, steps whereby they would feel some of their grievances and issues are addressed. But that was really part of a process that we had been working with local Bahrainis from the time the king came to power in 2002 and when he announced the constitution and they had elections and the reestablishment of the Council of Representatives, which is their legislature. And when I was there in Bahrain from 2004 to 2007 is when we had the momentous 2006 parliamentary elections where Wifaq, the Shia opposition, for the first time participated. And I'm not saying it's because we convinced them, but we certainly did see the importance of political inclusion and using peaceful means within the body politic to achieve objectives. And that was something that we counseled to the Wifaq leadership with the knowledge and the acceptance of the leadership of the Bahraini government. So that dynamic was something that was in play long before. But what it did was it helped us in 2011 when the tensions happened. And of course, especially after so many people were arrested and Pearl Roundabout was brought down and the Peninsula Shield came across the causeway, there was at least a foundation for some kind of discussion between parties. People knew who was who and how to be able to look at, all right, how can we deal with this? And of course, the Crown Prince was the logical the Crown Prince was the logical interlocutor to that end. Now, the fact that it wasn't ultimately successful in the short term means there's still work to be done. But parliamentary elections were just announced for November 24th, so we'll see. We'll see where that goes, who will run, and in what capacity.
Here you go.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador, for these very insightful remarks. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about the outreach by King Abdullah to Assad that you mentioned. Of course, there are those who argue that this was much more cosmetic than substantive in nature. And I just wondered whether you had examples of concrete financial incentives he offered, or how really did he try to bring Assad back, as you put it, into the Arab world?
You know, I can't really tell you anything specific. I'm sure there were incentives, but those kinds of things are usually rather quiet. Because they could be incentives for the country. There could be other kinds of incentives which will be not named. But I can tell you that a lot of time and effort was spent trying to do it, and that was really the sole focus of his son, who had tried to cultivate a personal relationship. Don't forget, in Syria, a lot of Saudis had their own personal investments in Syria. Actually, a lot of Gulfies have investments in Syria. There are a lot of Syrian women married to Saudis. You see a lot of family ties. You see a lot of cross-border traffic. I don't know how many summer farms in the Syrian countryside are owned by Gulf families. So there were already sort of a foundation for we can invest more, we can do more, we can help you more. One thing that a lot of the Gulf countries have done in the past, and this may be the case with Saudi Arabia, although I can't speak to it for sure, is that oftentimes they will increase the quota of the number of individuals who can come and live and work in that country to increase the number of the amount of remittances that go back to that country. But it was very, and of course there was a time, and I wish I had the details, I didn't have a chance to check this last night, when there were tensions, and with Lebanon, King Abdullah actually went to Damascus and then went down to Beirut with al-Assad in a way which was a very powerful scenario. I want to say it was like 209, 210. So he tried not just economically, but also in terms of prestige and power and imprimatur to help Bashar, but that obviously wasn't enough.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk about the role of the Gulf in pushing the Arab League to put out a request to the Security Council to intervene in Libya, and how much the Saudis and Emiratis, like the role they played in that process?
You know, I really am not equipped to answer that question. Libya was a big issue more with the Emiratis and the Qataris than with the Saudis because of the role their military plays in flying and their role later on in advising and equipping the different militias that were basically slugging it out in the aftermath of al-Qaddafi. So I can't really address the Saudi piece in that, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, with your experience in dealing with Gulf countries, and especially now after the Iraq War and then Arab Spring, and Gulf countries are, as you mentioned, as we all know, that playing a great role in most of events going on in the Arab world, let's say from Morocco to Syria. How do you see or foresee U.S. role in better understanding or better dealing with those issues through Gulf countries? I mean, because up to this moment, most of these things are damage control more than even crisis management. How do you, with your experience in dealing with these things, how you advise, or let's say not advise, give your thoughts about better understanding and better dealing of diplomacy as a form of whatever you can call it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of diplomacy, we were very much involved through the different organizing principles, whether it was Friends of Yemen or Friends of Syria, coordinating very closely with our European in particular and other GCC partners. That part is true. Where I think we have not been as good is because we have not been willing to put more muscle into the game, and that's a military piece of it, with the exception, of course, against ISIS, where we have. And that's where these countries have decided to take upon their interests in the way that they see fit. And you certainly see this in Libya, for example, where the Emiratis are really at odds with Qatar and then, of course, how that reflects itself in the different Libyan forces on the ground, whether it's whether oil should be sold independently or under the national oil company, where the basis of government stands, etc. And also Egypt plays a role in that with the Emiratis as well. But we have not been able to, they're newly empowered. They have found their footing, and they see their interests not always as exactly tracking with ours. And I think one reason is what happened in Syria and the fact that we didn't put enough muscle into the game in Syria. And then, of course, the second part is the Iran nuclear deal and wondering what that meant in terms of our commitment to them. So you started seeing them edge away a bit. They will always be close allies of ours. They will always look to us. They may visit Moscow. They may visit China. There are a lot of strategic and economic interests, it's true. But when it comes to national security, I still am convinced they look to us, at least for now, first. But they have other interests that they're pursuing. And what's interesting is how they're looking to pursue different interests in ways that sort of bring us in. And I think if you look at where the Emiratis and the Saudis have been trying to get the U.S., and the U.S. then reciprocating on the question of mounting some kind of economic campaign against Iran, you see that relationship very clearly. I'm never quite sure who's pulling whose chain on that.
One last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your really helpful overview. You began your remarks by saying that in the U.S. government, people want to be on the right side of history. You've had a lot of experience, you're now retired and out of government.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, when you look back on this whole episode, which side of history do you think we actually have ended up on?
Michael, leave it to you to ask the tough question. Look, I think that when we lead with our values and when we lead with our interests that are in support of people and voices, but does not sacrifice security in that country and well-being, is when we do our best. And there have been times we have done that. When we look at things through a geopolitical prism without understanding what the ground looks like, we have not done well. And I think Iraq certainly is an example of the latter. I think in other places, like in Tunisia, we've done a better job. And I think we can be a force for moving things in the right direction. but the policy has to be right. And personnel is policy, and certainly in our government. And the personnel has changed. So the question is, how do we keep things going in the right direction with the policies that we have in a way that doesn't take us to a point where we can't come back to what I think is a place where we can do good. So that's how I'd answer it.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.